Well, good morning. This is John Lucas. I'm going to try to show you two different ways to turn a rosette this morning. Okay, the first thing I did was faced off the wood because this piece of wood wasn't totally flat. And so I wanted to make sure it was flat, so I used a bowl gouge and a scraper to kind of get it fairly flat. I drew my lines. This is fairly typical of a rosette. We have a slight bead right here, kind of a center bead, and this is kind of a bead that turns into an ogee or a bead to a cove. And then we'll have two cuts made with a parting tool, and then we'll have a bead right here. And this is fairly typical of several designs that I looked for. First, the tools I'm going to use to do this are really simple. We're going to use a parting tool, and we're going to use a skew as a scraper. This is not necessarily the way I would turn it, but I wanted to show you this method because it's very simple and anybody can do it. I'm going to raise the tool rest up slightly. In this case, I have the tool rest a slight distance away from the board because you have a long bevel right here, and I don't want to be writing down there. I want to be sitting on top of that to make the cuts easier. So we'll turn the lathe up fairly fast for this part. Now I make a double cut on these. I want to get it a little bit wider than the parting tool. And the reason I do that is so that if you stick the tool straight in like this, you're scraping and you're not getting a very clean cut. What I really want to be doing is riding the bevel. So I'm up here like this where it's not cutting. I lift the tool down until it starts to cut, which is right about there. Now what I can do is I can tilt the tool slightly and take really gentle cuts across the face, and I get more of a shear cut that way, and it's a little bit, I get a cleaner cut that way, so I don't have to sand as much. Now this is going to be my cove, and I want it slightly below the surface. And normally I would take a lot of time to measure all this. We're going to do it a little bit slower. So that's the depth of my cove. So we'll just make a little stair step here to kind of give me an idea of where I'm going. This is my bead. Now this area right there is going to be the smaller bead. So what we'll do is we'll take the skew, and I'm just going to kind of carve it like this a little bit. We'll kind of make that little detail. Turn the skew over. Now I know all you skew lovers are probably panicking right now. Just very gently reach into that corner, kind of drag it back across. Now we've got a bead out here, so we're going to knock these corners off. Let me move my dust collector out of the way a little further. Now you'll notice that I have the tool flat on the tool rest. I don't want to tilt it up. It won't get a catch if you're doing this. In my early days of turning, I did a lot of turning like this because you can really sneak up on the cut. The problem is these are all scraping cuts, so the finish is not going to be very good. I forgot that I do need one more tool. We're going to use a round nose scraper to do this cove, and you always go from the high point to the low point. The grain is running in this direction, and I want to be cutting downhill on the grain. So we'll cut from the left side down, And then we'll cut from the right side down. Now, since this is a regular scraper, you always need to keep the handle higher than the cutting edge. If I start trying to cut like this, I'm going to get a catch. So I keep it up fairly sharp. Go down to the bottom, top to bottom. Now we'll just clean up this corner just a little bit. Just be real gentle. I'm going to take my parting tool. I'm going to go in here again with the bevel rubbing. And just clean that up a little bit. Let's see what it looks like. Okay, that's not too bad, but you can see in here, the grain is running this way. So right in this area, I'm cutting downhill with the grain. In this area right here, I'm cutting uphill with the grain. So you'll notice there's a lot more tear out in these areas, and that requires a lot more sanding to get those out there. I also have some bad details right down in there. I didn't get it really clean. So let me turn that up. And we'll take the skew and I'll try to reach way back in that corner. Again, make sure the tool's perfectly flat. And that's not too bad. The problem with this whole concept, though, using a scraper, is that if I have real fine details, like the corner right here, should be fairly sharp looking. If I go in there with coarse sandpaper and I sand very aggressively, I can round off that corner and you no longer have the clean details. So what we'll do now is I'm going to show you how to do the same basic piece using a spindle gouge and my parting tool. I still need the parting tool for this area. I could do this area with my spindle gouge, but I won't be able to do that with a spindle gouge. That has to be done with my parting tool. Now, unfortunately, the camera won't show these details very well, but there's still a fair amount of tear out right down in here and right down in there and a tiny bit right there. And I've sanded pretty aggressively with 150 grit. And I think you can understand that if I wanted to make 20 of these like I did for a friend many years ago, that I really wouldn't want to have to spend that much time sanding if I could get away from it. So now, okay, now we're going to do the same thing, but this time I'm going to use cutting tools instead of scraping tools. I'm going to use a Thompson detail gouge. I'm going to use a bowl gouge, a parting tool, and probably the toe of my skew for maybe just one cut. So let's get on with it. Oops, I need to raise my tool rest slightly. That's good. Now I want to make my initial cuts with a parting tool. Again, I'm going to lower it down so that it's rubbing the bevel. Lift up and make my cut. We'll go over here and we'll make the same depth. Now I'm going to make the additional cuts. I'm going to clean up both sides as careful as I can. The trick with getting a clean cut with a parting tool is, number one, these sides are actually sharp. So if I've ground it properly, these sides are sharp as well as that. And if I'm cutting at this angle where it's rubbing the bevel, the wood's coming across there at a fairly sharp angle. So it leaves a fairly clean cut, particularly if I take passes just down the side of both sides. I've got a little tear out right here where we expected it because it's going uphill. So I'm going to make another real light pass. Part of the trick is not pushing the cut. If I push the cut very hard, that's where I get the tear out. You have to let the tool do the cutting. Now this is where my cove is going to be, so I want to cut that down below my surface. Now I leave a little bit of a bump right there so I know where my border was supposed to be. And this is going to be my bead, so I'm going to stair step it a little bit. Cut that down a little deeper. There we go. Now you could even go in here and take away a little bit of this just to speed things up. You know, we could make a little stair step there because that's going to be my bead. Now I'm going to take my my detail gouge, and again I'm going to rub the bevel. I'm going to turn the speed up a little bit. It's going a little slow in the middle. And one thing I do that you can't see from the camera angle is that the tool, I'm rubbing the bevel, but my arm is locked in position and I move my body to do the cut because you have to steer the cut with the handle. So we'll start out here and we'll make a cut. And I'll pull my body around. There we go. But you see where the tool ends up? It started over here and now it's over here. Now we're going to go back here and I'm going to rub the bevel. And I'll use my hips to move the cut. I watch the cut progress and I move my body accordingly. And we'll just connect those two. The tool's kind of bouncing because this wood has a lot of hardwood and softwood right next to each other, the heartwood. And so it takes a little bit more tool control. Just right to the bottom. Now we'll go to this side and we'll try to get my fingers out of the way so you can see the tool cut better. And we'll clean up that just a little bit more. There we go. Now, I'm going to show you how to turn this bead in a few minutes. But the difference in this tool and my bowl gouge is how these tips are ground. This one is ground much more blunt than this one. To do a cove on this one, I'm going to have the tool up here really sharply. And it's a little bit of a tricky cut. If I use the bowl gouge, I can have the handle up a little bit higher, and it makes it easier for me to reach in there and control it. So again, we'll rub the bevel. Now I show in one of my other videos how this is a lot like scooping ice cream. You start with the flute sideways, and as you go down to the bottom, the flute ends up flat. But what you have to be careful of is you have to be careful of rubbing the bevel. I'm going to turn the lathe off for a second and show you. Right about there's where it's actually cutting, and I'm rubbing the bevel. If I go down here, I'm not rubbing the bevel anymore, I'm scraping. So I'm not going to get a clean cut. So I want to rub the bevel, find the cut. Be very gentle. Now when you're starting the cut right here, there's a tendency for the gouge to kick back on you. And the reason the tool kicks back, and I'm not sure how I can show that really clearly, we'll take a skew for example. If you were looking down at the tool from the top, if I have it angled this way, it's going to kick back this way. If I have it angled this way, it's going to kick back that way. There's no bevel rubbing at that point because you haven't really entered the wood. So what we want to do is, when we start the cut, since we know it's going to try to kick back, I start the cut extremely gently, and I put my thumb right here to kind of hold it, and I'll start that cut. And once you get the cut started, you have a shoulder. Once you get that shoulder, it won't kick back. So if we imagine this bead, for example, being my shoulder, when I start that, if I start that cut right here and I get going, now it's got a shoulder and it can't possibly kick back because it's hitting against that. So again, I'm going to start, and it doesn't matter which angle you're at per se. You can get by with different angles. The trick is starting that cut really, really lightly. And I don't know if the camera's going to show that because the lighting's kind of flat. But I've got a bit of a shoulder there right now. I won't kick back, so I can push it down in, lower the handle, and just blend those two cuts. Now while I've got this tool, I can go ahead and clean this up because my parting tool may not have cleaned it up as good. Now a trick that I use when I'm doing that cut is that if I go across here with the flute up like that, when it catches that shoulder, it's going to jerk the tool over, and I'm going to get a catch. So what I do is, as I start that cut, when I get close to the edge, I rotate the tool, and now that lower wing is going to touch the corner of the cut, and it won't kick back on me. If I had the wing up, this is called an unsupported edge, it's going to pull the tool down. But in this position, it can't do anything. So I'll make a real light cut. I'll turn the handle over. And this tool is actually a little dull. I've been using it a lot this morning. So let's do the same thing with the right there. So I've turned it over so the bottom of the flute is touching, and you see it doesn't really cut at that point. Now to turn a bead with square-sided shoulders, like this would be, is really challenging. You have to move the tool all the way around to here to get this bevel rubbing. And the same thing on this side. I start the cut, and as I come around here, I go all the way around there. And I have to move the tool a long ways if I do a push cut around the corner. And I found it kind of difficult to do. So over the years, turning so many of these hand mirrors that I do that often have beads in this position, I figured out that when I turn a bead on a spindle, I start the cut right here, and I sort of rotate the tool over, and the cut goes down the wing a little bit, and I roll around this way, and I don't have to move the handle as far. Same thing over here. I can pull it this way and pull it around. Now, when I had the tool rest in the normal position, as I start to roll this around, my handle actually hits the lathe, and I can't move the handle far enough. So I found out one day that the wood doesn't really know where we are. It's a circle. So if I raise the tool rest up, and I'm going to raise it up even further just to show you that it doesn't really matter. What I can do now is I rub the bevel, I rotate the tool over, and I cut off that wing. So what I'm doing is, as the tool rotates, I'm lifting the handle, and I'm moving the handle to my left, and I cut all the way down across there. So just gently moving the handle. Now when I go over here, instead of having to move the handle all the way around like this, what I can do now is I can rotate it the same way I just did and pull the handle around, and the handle doesn't have to go as far, and the handle doesn't hit the bed of my lathe. So I'm going to move the handle an extreme amount just to show you that it clears the bed. Now granted, this is a 20-inch lathe, so I've got a little more room to clear the bed. You'll have to excuse me from blowing into the mic. It's a bad habit. So the only thing I've got left right now, it's a little bit dull right in there from my gouge not being real sharp. So I'm going to stop and sharpen that real quick. Okay, I reground the outside, and now I'm going to take my little fish hook sharpening tool and just polish off that burr a little bit. Inherently, a bowl gouge ground at 55 degrees is not going to cut as clean as a spindle gouge at 35 degrees. But to get this cut, it just makes it easier to do. So I put a fresh edge on there. I'm going to not force the tool. I'm going to take it a little more gently. Now the bottom is where it's going to always tear the grain worse. So I want to take a real gentle cut across there. Let's see if that didn't straighten it up. Pretty good, pretty good. Very light at the very bottom. Okay, the trick I used there was to, if the gouge is cutting in this position, the wood's crossing that tip at 90 degrees. That's a fairly coarse cut and doesn't cut as clean. If I can cut with the tool rotated very slightly, either in this direction or this direction, it's more of a shear cut and you're just going to get a cleaner cut. Now I've got the tiniest bit of tear out. Let me blow those off and drive you nuts blowing on my microphone again. This side is cut pretty clean. The outside of that has got just a little bit of tear out right down the bottom. And again, that's because a parting tool never cuts quite that clean. So what I'm going to do is take the toe of my skew and very carefully, I got to move my tool rest a tiny bit, very carefully go down through there. And now I have a nice clean shoulder. Should take almost no sanding at all to get that out. So that's how I would do it. So I hope you learned something from that. There are several ways to actually get this same procedure, but hopefully that'll work for you.